Hello my dear students. Today in this very part of chapter number 2, I Harshita Mishra will talk about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So before going to know about how the sexual reproduction takes place in the flowering plants, it is very much important for us to have a glimpse of the structure of a flower and what are its reproductive parts. So let's have a glimpse of the flower. So here is a typical structure of an angiospermic flower. This is a typical structure of an angiospermic flower, and if somebody asks you what is flower means in terms of definition, so we'll define flower as a modified stem which functions as a reproductive organ and that produces ova or pollen, and these ova and the pollen are the two reproductive uh, and very much important in the sexual reproduction of the flowering plants, which are produced by the reproductive organs in the flower. And those reproductive organs which will produce ova is the female reproductive organ of the flower, and the pollen will be produced by the male reproductive part of the flower. So have a look on the male and the female reproductive parts of the flower. See, first of all, having a look on the male and the female reproductive parts, let's see the typical angiospermic flower. This typical angiospermic flower consists of the four holes of the floral appendages that is attached on the receptacle. Here is the receptacle, you can see this is the receptacle shown here, and this receptacle contains both the male and the female reproductive parts. And these male and the female reproductive parts, this male reproductive organs consist of the stamens, and stamens together constitutes the what filament and anther. See here, this is a typical this is a this is a male reproductive part of the flower. This is the male reproductive part of the flower, means anther and filament. So collectively it is called as stamen. Okay, so collectively it is called as a stamen, which is one of the whole of the out of the four floral appendages, and the other is the calyx and corolla. Calyx and corolla, where you will find this calyx. This calyx is this, the very much green part. You can see this is written as sepal, so you can call it as calyx also. See, the green part present near the ovary. This is the ovary where the female reproductive organs takes place, female reproductive organ originates, and this ovule is refers to as the female reproductive part. This is your female reproductive, this is the female reproductive part of the flower, and this comprises of stigma, style and ovary, and these collectively, stigma, style plus ovary, will constitute pistil. So collectively, if somebody asks you what are the female reproductive parts of the flower, so female reproductive parts of the flower, you will write down stigma, style and ovary. These are the three parts of the female reproductive parts of the flower, which is collectively known as pistil. And if somebody asks you what are the male reproductive parts of the flower, so we'll say anther and the filament. See, so this anther and the filament is together called the stamen, and this male reproductive part is termed to be the androecium. This is called as androecium, and this female reproductive part is called as gynoecium. This is called as gynoecium. This is called as gynoecium. So gynoecium and androecium, which is the male reproductive part, constitutes anther and filament, together called stamen, and this female reproductive part, which is called as pistil, consists of stigma, style and ovary, refers to as gynoecium. Okay, so this was all about a typical angiospermic part of the flower, and this a typical angiospermic part of the flower consists of what? The four holes of the floral appendages, and those floral appendages are calyx, corolla, and the male reproductive part, I have already told you, stamen, and the female reproductive part. So how many there occurs? First hole is the calyx, the base at present at the base here, and if we talk about where is corolla, so this petal is refers to as corolla, the most attractive part of the flower through which the pollinators are attracted. This is petal is refers to as corolla, and sepal as calyx. So never confuse with the terminologies petal and sepal. Sepal means talking about calyx, and if we talk about petal means we are talking about corolla. And this is the first hole, calyx is the first hole of the flower, second is the corolla, third is the male reproductive part, and the 4 reproductive part is the female reproductive part. So there are complete 4 holes. We have talked about typical angiospermic flower, 4 holes. We have talked about all the 4 holes of the flower. So this was all about a glimpse of an angiospermic flower and the reproductive part. So these 2 reproductive part that will play an important role in reproduction will be androecium and gynoecium, and I have already told you an androecium comprises of anther and stamen, and gynoecium comprises of stigma, style and ovary, collectively called as pistil. Towards the next slide, if we talk about the reproductive parts of the flower, means now we'll talk about separately about stamen, we'll talk about pistil, and among that pistil we'll talk about stigma, style and ovary. So have a glimpse on this. The reproductive part of the flower consists of the following. So first I'm talking about stamen. So you must know that I'm here talking about the anther and the filament. I have told you this part comprises of 2 parts. The first very part is the anther and the second very part is the filament. This anther is a yellowish sac-like structure which is involved in producing and storing the pollen. Means this is you can call this part as the fertile part that comprises of the male gamete, and this male gamete will be responsible for undergoing fertilization with the female gamete and forming the flower. So this will undergo sexual reproduction. Which part will go under sexual reproduction? Anther will perform the sexual reproduction in the flowering plants, because the pollen, this pollen is what? This is pollen is your main gamete that is responsible for the formation of a flower that will undergo what I can say fertilization. So this anther is refers to as the fertile part. This is refers to as the fertile part, and the filament is just a slender thread-like project which functions as by supporting the anther, means it is a supporting organ we can call. So there is no role of the filament in sexual reproduction in the flowers. So you can call this part as the sterile part. Okay, it has been several times it has been asked that which part of the flower among the androecium is refers to as the sterile part. So remember, the filament has no role in the sexual reproduction. It is just an organ which provides a support to the developing anther, and that developing anther consists of comprises of the pollens which are the which will perform the which contains the gametes that are responsible for undergoing sexual reproduction and will form a new flower, so a new plant. This is the sterile part, this is the fertile part. One things you have, this is the very much important thing to be remembered by you. And if we talk about the female part of the flower, that is, I am talking about the pistil. See, if I'm talking about pistil, means I'm talking about stigma, style and ovary. This is the innermost part and the female reproductive organ of a flower, which comprises of the 3 parts. Those 3 parts are stigma, style and ovary. This is collectively known as the pistil. First of all, we'll talk about stigma. Stigma, it is the topmost part or the receptive tip of the carpel. This is the part that will receive the pollen. This is the part that will receive the pollen from the anther. The anther that contains pollen, and these pollens will land on the stigma, and then the fertilization will take place. So stigma is refers to as a receptive organ for the pollen grains. Okay? So stigma has a role in receptivity. Stigma plays a role in receptivity, and it is the topmost part or receptive tip of the carpels in gynoecium of a flower. What is style? It is a long slender tube like structure similar to the filament, which have the role in connecting the stigma to the ovary. Okay? It is a connecting link between stigma and ovary. And style is a way from where the pollen comes to the ovary, means it provides a passage. Style, you can say style provides the passage for the pollens to come to the after being received by the stigma. Style becomes the passage for the pollens to come up to the ovary. So, and style is a connecting link between the stigma and the ovary. And if we talk about ovary, what is ovary? It is a ductless reproductive gland that holds a lot of ovules in it, and it is the part of the plant where the seed formation takes place. So got it? So the seed formation will take place inside the ovary, and under that ovary you will find out many of the ovules. So this is all about, we have studied about the reproductive parts of the flower, and among that reproductive part of the flower, which part is the fertile and which part is sterile, we have talked about. So remember all these things. These are very minor things, but these things are to be remembered by you. So now moving towards the next. See, if I talk about pre-fertilization, this is a stage when the before undergoing fertilization. This is an event that takes place before fertilization. So, before undergoing fertilization, how the structure, male and the female reproductive parts develop the gametes, means male and the female gametes, ova and the pollen grains. And those pollen grains have those male reproductive parts have a typical structure. So, you must know about the structure. You must know about the structure of the male and the female reproductive parts, and how those male and female reproductive structures undergoes the for the formation of the male and the female gametes. Those that is refers to as events, and the very first part we'll discuss here about structure, and then we'll discuss about the events taking place for the formation of the male and the female gametes. So there are several hormones which are responsible for the pre-fertilization and structural changes that results in the development of the flower. Inflorescence first of all bears the flower buds and then the flowers. Flowers are refers to as the reproductive part of the flower because they carry the male and the female reproductive parts, which is responsible for the fertilization to takes place. So first of all, we'll talk about how the gamete formation and what is the structure of that structure. What is the actually we'll talk about the structure of androecium. Okay, we'll talk about first of all we'll talk about the male reproductive part of the flower, means we'll talk about androecium and the structure of androecium, structure of anther. Okay, we'll talk about structure of androecium if I'm saying, so I'm talking about the structure of anther and the structure of filament, and how those anther forms the pollen and how they undergo the process known as microsporogenesis to form the pollen grain, that is the male gamete. So see here, androecium. The androecium consists of the whorls of stamen, and those whorls of stamens are your this anther and the filament. This is your filament, anther and filament. This is the filament. This is filament. This is the filament, anther and filament. The stamen consists of the filament, which is long and slender, we have learned earlier, and the anther is a bilobed structure, that is they are dithecous. Means what does this mean? Anther is bilobed and dithecous. If we see a typical anther which is shown in your NCRT, so that typical anther structure is bilobed and dithecous. Okay, means this you if you see the structure, this is a TS of the anther. This is a TS of an anther taken. Here is a typical structure of an anther. This is A structure, shows you the typical anther structure, 3D structure of the anther, and this is the TS taken of the anther. If you cut this anther, if transversely, we'll found that this anther comprised of the two lobes. What are these two lobes? These you will find this type of a separation you are seeing now. So one lobe you will found here and the other lobe will found here, and these two lobes are these two lobes consist of the two compartments. These two compartments are called theca, and if there are two compartments in each, so they are refers to as dithecous. Okay, why I have written dithecous? Because it comprises of the two compartments. Okay, two compartments in each lobe. So it is first of all it consists of the two lobe. One lobe is here, first one is here, and the second lobe is here, and each of these two lobes comprises of the compartments which is refers to as theca, and the consist of the two compartments in each lobe. Therefore it is refers to as dithecous. So this is a single, if we talk about a single compartment, it is refers to as theca. So do not confuse. And if the two in a single lobe, two compartments are present, that means it is called as dithecous. So this is all about anther is bilobed and dithecous. Now if we come to see this these lobes contain several pollen grains, also refers to as microsporangia, and these microsporangia which contains the microspores. Okay, these are the pollen sacs which contains several pollens inside it, and here is used this is shown a line of dehiscence. Line of dehiscence is that line from which the mature pollen dehisces out after being matured. These pollen lines have these lines of dehiscence are the line that shows the ruptured line which is formed after the pollen being mature. They release out from these line of dehiscence. You can see here the pollens being released out here. This is the pollens that are being released out through line of dehiscence. Okay, so these are the ruptured lines. So when the pollen grains mature, these pollens dehisces out from this very line. So theca are separated by a longitudinal groove running lengthwise. See, you can see this is separated by longitudinal grooves. This is the longitudinal grooves. This is separating the theca. And the microsporangia are located, this is I have talked about pollen sacs, or you can call it as microsporangia. Pollen sacs or microsporangia. Okay, so this microsporangia comprises of what? Pollen grains, and are located in each thecas, and they further develop to form the pollen sacs, and those pollen sacs will contain the pollen grains. Now moving towards the next, how is the structure of microsporangium is, means how the, if we have cut that structure, if you have gone through a longitudinal section of that structure of a microsporangium, if we see a detailed structure of microsporangium, so first of all we'll find that the structure of a microsporangium is surrounded by a 4 wall layers, and those 4 wall layers are epidermis. Those 4 wall layers are epidermis, endothecium, middle layer, and tapetum. And outer 3 layers plays a role in providing protection to the developing pollen, and this layer plays an important role in providing nourishment to the developing embryo. Got it? This very tapetum is the layer, the innermost layer, which is helpful in providing the nourishment to the those developing pollen grains. And in the young anther, the sporogenous tissue forms the center of each microsporangium. In the young anther, if we'll come to see the process of microsporogenesis, means the formation of the pollen grain, there we'll found the sporogenous tissue, and how those sporogenous tissues are responsible for forming each microsporogenous cells, and those microsporogenous cells will form the microspore mother cells, and from that each and every microspore mother cells will form the pollen grain. So this is all about the structure of microsporangium. Have a of a this. If you cut a longitudinal section, go through an NCERT, the figure has been given. These are the 4 layers we have talked about here in the previous slides. That we have talked about epidermis, we have talked about endothecium, we have talked about middle layer. See, this is the outermost layer, epidermis. If you cut the section of microsporangia, I have taken a single lobe. Okay, it is a diathecous structure, and if you cut a section and take a part of it to have a look of all the 4 layers, so we'll found the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, and then we'll found the endothecium, the second most layer, and then middle layer. This all 3 layers are protective in nature, told you, and this is the sporogenous cells, and these sporogenous cells which together will constitute a sporogenous tissue, and that will form the microspore mother cell, and these microspore mother cells will convert into the or develop into the pollen grains. And if I have talked about tapetum, this is the innermost layer surrounding the sporogenous tissues for providing the nourishment to the developing embryo. This is a longitudinal section of a microsporangia here taken over here, and those microsporangia, how those microsporangias how many layers of the walls they are made up of, this is all shown in this very figure. So in the next very part of this video, we'll talk about how the pollen grains are formed, means how the structure, we have talked about the structure here up to this very part, and in the coming part I'll talk about the events that takes place during the formation of the pollen grains. So thank you right now.